Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Always glad to have with us on a Tuesday morning Dr. Gary Ostrower, who's calling in from St. Bonaventure University this morning. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Well, we should note that he's a longtime Alfred University history professor. How long have you been teaching at the university, Gary?
Too long. No, I've been teaching at AU for 50 years. I was teaching at Vassar College for a couple of years before I arrived at Alfred. So I've been teaching on the college level for exactly 52 years.
That's great. Well, let's get right to it. Let's start out with the oil refinery fire situation in Saudi Arabia.
Well, I think that's really big. And it may turn out to be even bigger than we realize. Historians got to be a little careful with reading headlines, and we don't know how this is going to work out. We don't exactly know. We don't really know who is responsible for this. The Trump administration has suggested that it was probably, but not absolutely certain, that it was the Iranians, and I think that's correct. I say that because the Houthis, which is a rebel group in Yemen, which has taken responsibility for this because the Saudis have been battling the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis have claimed responsibility, but I think it's unlikely, and I think this is probably agreed upon by many of the observers, that it's unlikely that the Houthis have the capability of creating, if you will, or putting together a very sophisticated attack on the Saudi oil refineries, especially the Aramco refinery. And what that means is that, well, for the time being at least, about one half of Saudi oil production, that's over 5 billion gallons a day, about one half of that has been curtailed. Now, how quickly they'll be back online, the Saudis are saying probably by the end of this month, which is, 2 weeks from now. That remains to be seen. And in the short run, at least, there's a lot of oil reserve around, so it's not going to have a dramatic effect on prices. The price of oil did jump about $11 a barrel immediately after word of the attack was received, but then it has since receded. So that, as I say, for the time being, I don't think we're going to see a dramatic impact. But I think the reason I say this is big is that it shows you, I think it proves that it doesn't take a huge effort to have a dramatic effect on what could be the long-term supply of oil or maybe even other resources these days. These drones cost, if I understand it, about $15,000 a piece. And I believe that there were something like 6 drones used. There may also have been some cruise missiles. We don't really know exactly. But the reality is that this is a relatively low-tech, it's a relatively inexpensive attack, and yet it has a serious effect, and maybe a very, very, very serious effect in the long run on oil production. So here we are in the United States. We're putting together a military budget that's close to $750 billion a year. We're building $25 billion carrier groups. We have planes that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and yet that kind of equipment is not going to prevent the sort of drone attack that we witnessed in the last few days. We may have to rethink in a very, very serious way our military strategy.
Dr. Ostrower, election day today over in Israel. Bibi Netanyahu has said that he's concerned about his political future. Did you have any thoughts there?
Well, he should be concerned about his political future. He's mired in corruption. He has his own party has been somewhat split. One of his key allies, a guy by the name of Lieberman, has broken with him. It's not at all clear that Netanyahu is going to win the election. This is, remember, the second Israeli election within 6 months, and I think a lot of Israelis are kind of tired of this sort of thing. It's possible that he will lose. He has, of course, the support of President Trump. And that in Israel may in some ways be every bit as important as it might be here in the United States. Nevertheless, I think that, one's going to have to leave something of a question mark until tomorrow, until we know who wins this election. And one should also note that in Israel, in contrast to the United States, you don't have just two major political parties. You have about 6 or 8 political parties that are vying, so that the Israelis, whoever wins the election, is going to have to put together a coalition. And coalitions are often unstable, and that certainly has proven to be the case over here. And if I can go back, if I may, to the Saudi situation, the Trump administration has two reliable partners. One partner is Saudi Arabia, and the other partner is Israel. And the Trump administration has largely lost the how shall I put it, the guaranteed support, the reliable support of almost every other one of our of the U.S. allies. I'm talking about our NATO allies. I'm talking about Japan and so forth. And so, we find ourselves somewhat isolated. Our ability to influence what goes on elsewhere, with the exception perhaps of Israel and Saudi Arabia, has been very much compromised. And one of the things that kind of puzzles me, but we got to deal with this as a reality, is our president's love affair with the Saudis, his very, very first foreign trip. A president's first foreign trip is usually either to Mexico or to Canada. Not for President Trump. It was to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis understand him. They flattered him. They fawned over him. He was, greeted with, every formal, kind of flattery. And he has been, I think, very, very supportive of the Saudi leaders ever since then. And when I say supportive, I mean supportive in the sense that he has supported their war in Yemen. He has supported a palace coup that the leader of Saudi Arabia, we call him MBS, had kind of organized about 2 years ago. He has not said a word in criticism of the Saudis about the assassination of the Washington Post reporter who was murdered in Turkey and then dismembered in Turkey in the Saudi embassy in Turkey. He has escalated. He's watched the Saudis escalate the war in Yemen, and that war, of course, is not being won. The more they escalate, the more the Yemeni rebels, the Houthis, have effectively resisted and so forth. And so we're kind of getting mired down in the Middle East, and Trump's policy. And here's what I find to be most puzzling. On one level, he says he really wants to withdraw from the Middle East. He wants to reduce the likelihood of war from the Middle East. On the other hand, he's taken a number of steps that have actually further embroiled the United States in the Middle East, and we see this most dramatically, I think, in Yemen. So, our policy is somewhat confused. Our allies don't know exactly where we are. We know, of course, that he has had that the president has offered something of a hardline program against the Iranians. He withdrew, of course, from the Iranian nuclear deal, and I think we're going to remain confused, and I think we're going to remain somewhat isolated during the next couple of years. That does not bode well. That just doesn't bode well for stability in that region.
Talking to Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, we reported at the 8 o'clock news that there's a new Siena College poll out today, has Elizabeth Warren in the lead among New York State Democrat voters. And other polls have her doing well nationwide. Your thoughts on the Warren campaign?
I'm surprised. I certainly did not anticipate that 3 or 4 months ago. She had a rally, I believe, in New York City just last night,
right,
and drew approximately 20,000 people. In other words, she's drawing the kind of crowds that President Trump, before he was president, when he was running, was drawing during his own campaign. I think that a lot of us are taken by surprise by the surge in Elizabeth Warren's popularity. Now, whether or not that popularity can translate into a victory in November of 2020 is something else. And I think that the Democrats are going to be in trouble right now, regardless of who they nominate. They simply don't have the kind of really popular figure, a kind of consensus figure that Barack Obama was in 2007 when he was running for the 2008 election, and again, of course, 4 years later. But I've been proven wrong often when it comes to predicting these things, and one has to give Warren credit. I think the one other thing that Warren has, which is certainly helping her, is that she appears to be very, very authentic. I mean, compared to the fellow in the White House who is he lies consistently. The Washington Post claims now that he has lied or made misleading statements somewhere between 11,000 and 12,000 times, and even his supporters understand that truth is not Trump's strong suit. Warren doesn't appear to be that kind of person. I think that her authenticity, her genuineness, is going to help her. But some of her positions, I think, are unrealistic. I think her support for Medicare for all, or at least until now, for Medicare for all, is going to be something of a burden on her. Most people, at least many, many, many people, don't want to give up their private health insurance. And, of course, that Medicare for all program is going to be very, very expensive, regardless of what Elizabeth Warren is saying right now. I mean, she's basically saying, yeah, we'll get this money by taxing, the 1% or the 10% or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that it is going to be expensive, and someone's going to have to pay that bill. So, I think all bets are off when it comes to the election in 2020.
What about Elizabeth Warren's plans to break up the big tech companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon? And I'm getting this from Axios, proposed breaking up those three companies, prohibiting companies with over $25 billion in revenue from acting as operators and users of a platform, and installing federal regulators to break up some of these mergers. What do you make of that?
Well, antitrust has often played well in American politics. And it certainly did around the turn of the 20th century. Woodrow Wilson used it very effectively. Teddy Roosevelt, I think, ran for president in 1904, a long time ago, right? But he ran on an antitrust program. Franklin Roosevelt ran on an antitrust program back in the late 1930s, and I think that certainly worked for him. However, in the real world, all those antitrust promises didn't fully materialize. And I think it's going to be very difficult to break up these companies. And they, remember, are not only national companies, they are also international. On the other hand, every so often you see it. Back, I believe it was in the 1970s, AT&T was broken up into a series of different companies. So we have Southern Bell now, we have Verizon. All of these were, part of what they used to call Ma Bell. Can it be done? The answer, I think, is yes, theoretically, yes. Will it be done? I doubt it.
It's kind of an interesting Democrat candidate is this Andrew Yang. Andrew Yang, what he wants to do is fight automation, saying that it's destroying millions of American jobs. And the other thing he wants to do that I think might appeal to some people is this idea of giving Americans and voters $1,000. What was it? $1,000 a week for a certain period of time.
Yes, it's guaranteed minimum income, GMI, I guess they call it, guaranteed minimum income. It's not a new idea. It was floated back during the latter part of the 19th century. It was certainly part of a rather vigorous campaign by a guy named Francis Townsend way back during the 1930s. He wanted to provide everyone with $5,000 a month. We didn't know where that money was going to come from, but, that was his idea. It didn't get very far, but it does have a certain kind of superficial appeal, and there is some economic sense to doing that kind of thing. On the other hand, there's going to be a lot of resistance to it, and I just don't know whether it's any more realistic in 2019 than it was in 1936 when it was proposed by Townsend. I think the more interesting part of Yang's candidacy is his technical. He's talking about issues, technical issues having to do with robotics and so forth that none of the other candidates are really addressing right now, including Elizabeth Warren. The fact of the matter is that, many of us may be out of work as artificial intelligence and as robotics generally take over to a degree that is predicted. In the past, automation has created as many jobs as it has eliminated. I'm not sure that's going to be the case in the next 50 years. And if I'm right about that, if that happens, then I think that what Andrew Yang is arguing in 2019 may become standard operating procedure by the time we are in 2030 or 2035. Anyhow, I think of all the candidates, Andrew Yang is the most interesting. I think that Andrew Yang is the most creative, but I don't think he's going to be taken as all that seriously as we see with these Elizabeth as a rally yesterday has suggested in New York City.
New York Times had an opinion piece a couple of days ago entitled "Joe Biden is Problematic."
Well, he is problematic. He's around 78 years old or thereabouts. He is a little bumbling. He is not the sharpest guy around, but he is reliable, and he has black support. And no Democratic candidate is going to win the presidency without African-American support next year. Biden has it. I don't know whether Elizabeth Warren will have it. Maybe she will. Perhaps Kamala Harris will have it because she is, of course, a mixed race. But, beyond that, I think all bets are off when it comes to black support. And, I don't know what's going to happen.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with Dr. Gary Ostrower from AU in just a moment. Stay with us.
Selecting a nursing home for a loved one isn't easy until you've discovered Hornell Gardens Nursing and Rehabilitation. Hornell Gardens delivers the highest level of care, compassion, and commitment with amenities and activities that will enrich body, mind, and spirit. It's a place that's close to home. Stop in for a tour of Hornell Gardens, located at 434 Monroe Avenue in Hornell, or to learn more, call 585-222-CARE or visit hurlbutcare.com.
And checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn. What do you got in store for us today, Rob?
Well, Brian, we've got high pressure in control, and that's going to result in a lot of sunshine across the southern tier. In fact, over the course of the next couple of days, weather looks like it's going to be very, very nice. We'll be cool through midweek, and then we'll start a warming trend on Thursday. That'll continue through the weekend. Yesterday, Memphis, Tennessee hit 100 degrees. We won't be turning that warm, but it does look like 80 or higher is a possibility by Saturday. For today, abundant sunshine, temperatures 70 to 75. Skies are going to be clear tonight. Will fall back to 45 to 50. More sun tomorrow, temperatures again 70 to 75. Tomorrow night clear, 45 to 50. Sunny, 75 on Thursday. Sunshine and 75 to 80 for Friday. Sunrise this morning was at 6:52. The sun will set tonight at 7:18.
Thank you, Rob. Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower. Today is September 17th. It's Constitution Day.
Well, this day in history. So on September 17th of 1787, the Constitution was signed by the men who had met, the so-called founding fathers who had met for that summer in Philadelphia. I just heard Rob Carolyn say that it was 100 degrees in Memphis yesterday. Those guys who met in Philadelphia back in 1787 could have appreciated that because they had no air conditioning. They had to close the windows of the hall in which they were meeting in order to maintain, if you will, confidentiality, secrecy, in respect to their work. So it must have been plenty uncomfortable. What we should remember is this: that about 55 members of that, delegates, if you will, from 12 of the 13 states. Rhode Island was not represented. Rhode Island was always kind of a maverick state, and they refused to cooperate with almost anything back in those days. So 55 men met to draft this new Constitution. Initially, they were just going to amend the existing Articles of Confederation. Some of our listeners may remember from their high school courses that was our first Constitution. But when they got to Philadelphia, they decided, nope, they're not going to amend the Articles because it would have taken unanimous consent, and they knew that Rhode Island was not going to consent, so they decided to draft an entirely new document. Was that legal? Not really. We call it extra legal. In any case, 55 of those guys met. Only 39 of them remained to sign the documents. And that's because approximately 16 or so decided that, for one reason or another, it was unacceptable. And the reason it was unacceptable to quite a number of them was because they feared, the guys who left, those 16 who refused to sign, that it gave too much power, that it gave too much authority to the new federal government. Now, compared to today, that Constitution in 1787 gave very, very limited power to the federal government, but it certainly did increase the power of the government over and above what existed with the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, the central government, the federal government, had no power to tax. It had no power to raise an army. It really had very, very limited power, had zero power over interstate commerce. And with the Constitution, those things were changed so that, yes, indeed, the Constitution would grant the federal government the right to regulate interstate commerce and, of course, the right to tax and the right to raise an army. And so those changes, I think, in many ways strengthen the country, strengthen the government in a way that allows us to survive after the Revolutionary War. By the same token, we should also remember that the new Constitution was signed, that is to say, that document was signed by quite a number of representatives from the southern states. They were all, of course, white, and they were supporters of slavery. And so what they did when they drafted that Constitution is to build into the document a recognition, if you will, of slavery. Slavery became quite literally legal. And I say that because there were plenty of people who were arguing around the time of the American Revolution. Some of them were Quakers, some of them were evangelical Christians. Some of them were people like Benjamin Franklin, who were just very, kind of secular oriented. They really were not religious people at all. But they were arguing that every man is created equal, that all men are, have the natural right to liberty. Even Jefferson said that, though he was a slaveholder. And so the supporters of slavery would build into the Constitution a number of clauses which, if you will, recognize the existence of slavery and kept it legal, including the so-called, the infamous 3/5 clause, which essentially defined a slave as 3/5 of a human being. And the reason they did that was because Southerners wanted to count the slaves for the purposes of representation, granting them greater numbers of representatives in the House of Representatives. And there are a couple of other things. There was a fugitive slave law that was built into the Constitution. The slave trade, the international slave trade was outlawed, but the domestic slave trade was not outlawed, which is, again, a recognition that slavery would continue within the 13 states at that time. And so, the Constitution has a lot of different features to it. To a certain extent, it's an anti-democratic document. The president is not directly elected by the public, but rather by the Electoral College. Senators were not going to be directly elected by the public, but rather by members of the state legislatures. Judges, of course, were going to be appointed. They weren't going to be elected. The Constitution makers, the Founding Fathers, had some real doubts about democracy. They viewed democracy in much the way that, many Americans today view socialism. And so they shied away from a very democratic document.
Well, we're out of time, but as always, very interesting having you on. Dr. Gary Ostrower, thank you for joining us.
And I urge everyone to reread the Constitution today in honor of the Constitution Day.
Sure thing, will do. Thank you so much, Dr. Ostrower.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.